It's good to see everyone out and about this morning. Let's turn to John chapter 4. We're going to talk about Jesus and the Samaritan woman. This is a lesson out of what we've been teaching downstairs in the high school class to some of the teenagers and to James. It's going to be a review. I guess really to all of us it is. We've all studied it before. But nevertheless, we'll be reading from John chapter 4, beginning about verse 7. Some history on that's in this book that I thought was interesting. It gives a date and some names on some things. Talks about the region of Galilee, or between Judea and Galilee was the region of Palestine known as Samaria. It was inhabited by a mixed race of people, part Jew and part Gentile. Talked about in 722 BC how Sargon II of Assyria destroyed the city of Samaria and the capital in the northern kingdom of Israel and carried the Israelites off into captivity, but they left some. They carried the most influential ones off to captivity. They left some of the poorer ones. And then, just like Nebuchadnezzar would do later when he conquered Jerusalem, he brought people in from Assyria, from kind of all over the place in Assyria, to settle also in the area of Samaria. And these people intermarried with the Jewish people that was still there and became a mixed race. And the Israelites came to hate them. It talked about also in 586 BC how Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And then beginning at about 536 BC, he allowed the Jews to start returning, and that was more or less completed by 516 BC. And talked about how the Samaritans wanted to help the Jews in rebuilding the temple and rebuilding the city of Jerusalem, and the Jews wouldn't allow them to do it. And so the Samaritans decided on account of that they was going to hate the Israelites and done everything they could to hinder that work. And so the Jews decided because the Samaritans was hating them, they was going to hate the Samaritans back. And so they had a real feud going amongst each other and couldn't stand each other. And that sort of brings us up to the time of, in our lesson here, when Jesus and his disciples were going up to Galilee, I believe it was. And they stopped there at this city of Samaria, in Samaria. And the disciples had gone on into town to get something for them to eat. And Jesus was still sitting outside town. It's about a quarter mile outside town at this well that they called Jacob's Well. And so we'll begin reading verse 7. It says, "A woman of Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, 'Give me a drink,' for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, 'How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink of me, a Samaritan woman? For the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans.' And Jesus answered and said to her, 'If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, "Give me a drink," you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water.' And the woman said to him, 'Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock?' And Jesus answered and said to her, 'Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life.' And the woman said to him, 'Sir, give me this water, that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw.' And Jesus said to her, 'Go and call your husband and come here.' And the woman answered and said, 'I have no husband.' And Jesus said to her, 'You have well said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband, and that you spoke truly.' And the woman said to him, 'Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship.' And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know, but we know but we know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth.'" We'll stop reading there for a moment and then go further in a little bit. It's interesting. The first question that's in this book says, how did Jesus get involved in the life of this Samaritan woman? So as he's sitting there at the well waiting, how did he get involved with her? What did he do? He asked for a drink of water. And this is the lesson that I used part of it in the invitation a couple of weeks ago to demonstrate to us how simple things can be some little simple something can get us started in a conversation with somebody in order to be able to hopefully teach them the gospel and convert them. This woman was coming to draw water, and Jesus just asked for a drink of water. And in doing that, then he was able to go further and talk to her about the gospel and ultimately to teach this whole city. So when, kind of takes her back. This whole city says he stayed there 2 days. Just the drink, asking for a drink of water can make the difference. And I'm not saying we ought to go around and ask everybody we meet for a drink of water, but there's a lot of times that when we do meet people, whatever our circumstance is at the time, we can strike up a conversation. I used to try to work a marketing program, and it was a network marketing program, and that's one of the things they taught us. When you go places, whatever's going on, talk to people and strike up a conversation, and then you can work that in to demonstrating the program that we was demonstrating. And so it's the same thing here. We don't have to know everything there is to know about the Bible, but we can take what we know and strike up a conversation, sort of in effect make a mini friendship with somebody, stir some interest in each other, and then we can work that around into talking to people about Jesus. And really, it's not complicated, and we don't have to know everything there is about the Bible, because a lot of times people kind of hesitate about wanting to do something like that, and they say, well, I don't know enough. Well, if you think about it, when Jesus called Peter and Andrew, I think Peter first went to Andrew, or Andrew went to Peter. I get mixed up at the moment. But nevertheless, one of them said, hey, we found the Christ. And one of them questioned it, and the other said, come and see. And on the way, they seen Nathanael, and they talked to him and said, hey, we found the Christ. And they talked to him about it. And he had a question about it, and he said, come and see. So we don't have to know everything there is to know about the gospel to teach somebody. All we got to do is have enough to know to start a conversation, promote some interest, and then we can do just like they did and say, come and see. I've got somebody that can help you with this, that knows more than I do. We don't have to profess to know everything. All we need to do is be able to bring somebody to a teacher, because quite often, as we've seen, that's what happened in the first century. People didn't have to do all the teaching themselves. All they had to do was bring somebody to a teacher. James, do you have something?
I think a lot of times we don't do it because we feel embarrassed. Maybe we're not a people person or something like that. But if we just have the same concern for others and put them before whatever uncomfortable feeling we might have in starting conversations, maybe we should practice starting conversations, and we feel more comfortable with it. But Jesus, instead of hatred for this woman because of who she was or where she came from, he did this on the basis of love. He couldn't have concern about her soul. If we want to be like Jesus, we have to have concern for people's souls. And there's a bunch of people around us that are lost. And so if our basis for love for God and love for other souls, we're going to learn, hopefully, how to overcome this uncomfortableness or embarrassment we might have. Or if it's a lack of knowledge, maybe we can study a little bit more and feel a little bit more comfortable. But if we understand that if we should be doing this, God wants us to do it, and we should love these people. And when we like Jesus, we should be doing this.
That's right. You know, there was a time when if you'd have told me I was going to get up and teach any Bible class, it wouldn't have mattered if it was adult class, the kids class, the littlest, I'd have said, is there not a cliff somewhere I could jump off of first, because I didn't feel qualified to teach. I wasn't at all comfortable about it. I'm not necessarily sure that I'm comfortable about it to this day, but I'll get up and fake it my way through. But nevertheless, and that's a good thing, because sometimes that's what we have to do. The way we get comfortable doing things is by doing it. When I started running cross country, I thought I was probably a pretty good runner. In the first day of practice that I ran, I think we ran 10,000 miles that afternoon or something, and I didn't do particularly good that day. But the more I stayed with it and the more I did it, the more I became comfortable at it, to the point that I would run places because I thought it was easier than walking. I ran upstairs because that was easier to me than walking up them. I've got over that now. But nevertheless, so we get comfortable with things by doing it. There's probably nothing that we do in life that the first time we ever tried it, we was comfortable at. But we get, just like Silas is walking and running some now. 6 months ago, he wasn't walking, he was just crawling. So he finally got to the point, he tried walking and he fell a bunch, but then as he got better at it, he's more comfortable at it, and he doesn't crawl as much as he did now, unless he's just got a toy on the ground he's playing with. So he's got comfortable with walking. And we can get comfortable with teaching people about Jesus. We get comfortable with it by doing it. Tom, do you have something?
Is we run into people like that too. You know, they'll say something that, why are you bothering me? I don't want to talk to you. Basically, that's what she told Jesus. She said there, she says, you know, when he asked her to drink, she says, you know, why are you asking me? You know, since I'm a Samaritan, basically, Jesus asked her a drink, and she gave sort of a sarcastic, you know, get out of my face remark back to him. Why are you asking me? I'm a Samaritan, you know. And then the parentheses and everything goes through. Shows, you know, that prejudice that was there. But we run into that same thing too. A lot of times we're turned off by the answer somebody gives us. Oh, okay, you're not interested. You know, turn around. Jesus didn't do that. He came through and he pushed it he went to the next level.
And that sort of brings us into the next question here. Is what racial barriers did Jesus overcome in speaking to this woman? The Jews felt like they were a superior race. Now, they were God's chosen people, and in the New Testament it points out that God didn't choose them because they were special. He chose them because of Abraham. Abraham was special to God. But the Jews felt like they were superior to everybody else, of any other race, it didn't matter. And so they looked down on everybody. And that was typically would have been the response this woman got from a Jewish man. He would have kind of thrown his nose up there and walked on by. He would have rather died of thirst than ask her for a drink of water, because he felt so superior and he didn't want his water contaminated by more or less her being on the same earth that it was. So she's confused in some ways, and so when he asked her for a drink of water, as Tom said, she was probably had a sarcastic attitude about it. Why are you asking me? I'm a Samaritan. And typically in this culture, a woman by herself and a man by himself typically didn't speak to each other, because they didn't want to, they had barriers that they had set up, I guess more or less to protect each other from being tempted to fornication or whatnot like that. So it wouldn't have been normal even for a man to have spoke to a woman alone like this. And so here's two things going on here. You think you're superior to me, and I'm a woman, and normally a man wouldn't speak to a woman anyway. So what's going on here? As we think about that, especially the racial thing, nobody should feel superior to anybody else because of a racial thing. Or even because talking about the part of he's a man and she's a woman. Men shouldn't feel superior to women because God made men first. Women shouldn't feel superior to man because God made them to be a helper for us, because we wasn't doing too good by ourselves. So there's no reason for any of us to feel superior. And from a racial standpoint, as recently as about 4,000 years ago, at Noah's time, we were all the same to begin with. And in our culture, especially in the South, we think, or in our nation really, we tend to have a conflict between black folks and white folks. Probably in Noah's time, they were a darker skinned people than we are. They were probably a light brown skinned people. We went to see the Ark exhibit a couple of years ago, and one of the displays they had was talking about how we could have got all the different colors or races or whatnot that we've got now. And it said that if at that time of Noah that they were a light brown skinned people, through selective breeding, just like we would breed cattle to get certain dominant traits that we want, or certain colors or types of cows, because the people tended to go off and focus in their different areas, and the Bible talks about the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, in the areas that they went to. They probably became dominant genetic traits that became dominant in those people, is how we got our different races or different skin colors of people today. Because ultimately, if you get technical about it, we're all one race. So that's how that came to be. So at least as recently as Noah, we were all the same. We was one race, and probably a light brown skinned people. So white folks shouldn't think that they're superior because we've got pretty white skin. Any other type of people shouldn't think they're superior because of whatever genetic traits they have. We're all the same. So, and I think that's an important thing that Jesus is demonstrating for us here. Whether it's a racial thing or whether it's a male-female thing, we don't need to be looking at ourselves superior, and we don't need to be looking down at others, because it's just, there's no reason to it, because ultimately we're all sinners. We all have that problem with sin, and none of us could fix it ourselves. If we was really superior, we could have maybe fixed that ourselves, but we're not superior. We're very inferior to God and Jesus especially. I mean, the Bible talks about man's even lower than the angels. We don't have nothing to be big-headed about or proud about. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So when we done that, we disqualified ourselves from heaven. We gave ourselves a problem we couldn't fix, and somebody else had to do it for us. And God and Jesus fixed that problem with sin for us. So as far as race goes, or sex, gender issues goes, we shouldn't be looking down on anybody. We shouldn't be feeling superior, because ultimately we're all the same. None of us is going to get to heaven without help. We had to have help from God. And ultimately, that's why God established the church, why Jesus established the church, so there would be people here that we could depend on to help us to get to heaven. As we've seen in the last couple of weeks with the sickness that's gone around and the very low numbers that's been able here to come to worship, we've all missed that. We've all missed being able to see each other and the help we get from each other. I think we get help from each other that we don't even realize just from having been here. We get built up. I know last Sunday morning there were 7 people here. There's at least twice that many, or maybe 3 times that many here this morning, probably closer to 4 times maybe. So that's a big encouragement to me. And so I know to some extent the little church we went to when we was in Wyoming, that we went to over in Idaho, there's normally 4 men there that can help with the worship service. And so I kind of understand now that there's a bunch more people here today, kind of how they felt when we all showed up. Because here added a bunch of people to their number, and it was a real encouragement to them. And so we encourage each other, we help each other, but as we talk about this idea of racism here, we need to be careful that we're not thinking we're superior to each other, because we're all the same ultimately. Any thoughts or comments on that? Okay. What did Jesus offer this woman that got her attention? Tom?
Well, the response he gave to her was, when she gave this sarcastic remark to him, he answered back to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Basically, he introduces God to her. Whether she really understood that whole concept or not was with the reply that she came back. She said, sir, you have nothing to urge. So she really didn't understand what he was saying. Basically, she heard, give me a drink, and then he responded something with her, and she comes back with another response, which is also a little bit sarcastic, is, you don't even have anything to drink with, So it sort of shows that she heard him, but she didn't hear him.
She didn't understand what he was saying. It's interesting, he's, like Tom said, he offered her, he'd asked for water, and what he got her attention with was, well, I could give you living water. And if you had this living water, then you'd never thirst again. And he was contrasting there a spiritual water with a physical water. She was still thinking in the physical terms. She said, sir, you don't have anything to draw with, and the well is deep. It's sort of like even if you had a cup, you can't get down to the depth that the water is. You got to have a rope and a bucket or this or that, whatever they use to draw water out of this well with. And she's saying, you don't have none of that. She didn't understand what he was talking about. But what Jesus was telling her, I could give you water that you wouldn't thirst again. He could give our souls a drink of water that would make it to where we wouldn't be thirsty ever again. He could provide that need. Because before Christ and the work he did to accomplish our salvation, we should and did have a spiritual thirst going on that couldn't be quenched. We needed our spiritual thirst fixed, and we couldn't take care of it ourselves. And Jesus fixed that, and that's what he's telling her. You've got a need that's more important than the water that's in this well, and I could fix that for you. Tom?
He also came through and said, sort of putting him down a little bit. He says, so you're not greater than our father Jacob, are you? When you look at that, here Jesus is making a claim, and she's going back and says, well, who do you think you are? Jacob dug this well. Are you greater than he is? Mm-hmm. And both the Jews and the Samaritans, looked up to Jacob in that aspect. They considered him as, one of their forefathers, somebody of great stature. So she tries to go back to Jacob, and who do you think you are? Do you think you're better than Jacob? Jacob was prior to you being Jews. He was sort of the father of us all. So who do you think? Who do you think you are? Are you better than Jacob?
That's a question that he answered for. She's still looking at things in a physical realm. She didn't understand the spiritual aspect of what he was talking about. And she did say that, well, Jacob, our father Jacob's the one who had this well dug. Are you better than him? And basically what he's saying to her, yeah, I'm a lot better than Jacob. But her answer to that when she said that, let's see. Jesus told her in verse 13, so whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up to everlasting life. And the woman said to him, Sir, give me this water that I may not thirst nor come here to draw. And so she's still looking at it even at that point in a physical aspect. She's thinking, okay, if I could get this water where I wouldn't have to thirst again, it'd be a fountain of life. I wouldn't have to tote this pitcher of water or this empty pitcher a quarter mile outside of town, draw the water up out of this well. She's done said it's deep. I remember when I was a kid, my mother's aunt that babysat us a lot, she had a cistern which was similar to a well out back behind her house. And that's where her water come from. So she'd had this pulley system fixed up, and she'd put the bucket down in there and let the bucket down. It'd fill up with water, and you had to pull it out. And I remember as a little kid, maybe Cohen size or maybe not quite that big, but the rope, she's going to let me help pull the rope up to get the water out. And it was heavy, and it was more than I could do by myself at that age. So when we think of that, this woman's thinking, if I could get some of this water, that's going to eliminate a lot of work for me. Because you thinking, when it's the hot summertime, who wants to go walking a quarter mile out of town, get this pitcher of water? The pitcher may have, we don't really know, but I can envision it. You see people in that kind of culture today that's got this pitcher, probably has 5 gallons or so of water in it, and they're walking along with it balanced on their head. How they manage that's beyond me. But nevertheless, they get it done. Well, if it's 5 gallons of water at 8 pounds to the gallon, so there's 40 pounds of water. I've toted 5-gallon buckets of water a little distance before, and it kind of gets tedious in a hurry. I wouldn't say toting around 40 pounds of water here and there very far was a fun job. And then you think about again in the wintertime, maybe there's ice on the ground. Here she's having to tote this maybe 40 pounds of water, slipping and sliding on the snow and ice or however the climate was there. So it wasn't a fun thing for her. So she's still focused on the physical. And she's saying, if you can give me some of this water, I don't have to make this trip every day again. And so you'd think she'd have to do it at least once a day, and depending on whatever was going on in her household, maybe it was cleaning day, she might have to make that trip 3 or 4 times to get the water she needed for that. So this was a lot of work. And so Jesus, when she tells him that she wants that water so she don't have to draw, Jesus says to her, go call your husband and come here. And the woman answered, said, I have no husband. And Jesus said to her, you have well said, I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, the one you have now is not your husband. In that you spoke truly. I often wondered why the woman would have answered him, I have no husband. To me, it seemed sort of like a come on to him. That here's this guy, this Jewish guy, he's talking to her, he's offering her this living water. And so it's always seemed to me like she had an extra motive in there involved. And when she said, I have no husband. But Jesus was able to answer and say, yeah, you're right. You don't have a husband. You've had 5 of them already, and the man you're living with right now is not your husband. And so that really impressed her, and she understood that in verse 19, the woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. When you think about it, that's sort of the understatement of the universe, that she perceived that he was a prophet. Here was the Son of God, who was a prophet and a priest and a king. And here he was involved in the creation of the universe and everything in it. And she's being able to talk to him and says, I perceive you're a prophet. And she goes on to say, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship. And Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you don't know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. The woman said to him, I know that the Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. And so, it's interesting, I think, and a lesson we can learn from this at this point was when Jesus told the woman she had had 5 husbands and the man she's living with wasn't her husband. It demonstrates to us that God is aware of us. God knows everything there is to know about us. We might be doing things that everybody here at church doesn't know about, maybe nobody else particularly in the whole world knows about, but God knows. You know, when this woman met Jesus and she told him she had no husband, she understood that from a physical standpoint, there was absolutely no way that this man would know that she had had 5 husbands and that she was living with somebody. You know, Jesus wasn't from around there. He was a Jew. Jews didn't typically, the Jews disliked the Samaritans so bad that typically rather than going straight up through Samaria like Jesus and his disciples did, they'd get up to the boundary borderline of Samaria, they'd cross the Jordan River, go up in Jewish territory, and then cross back again to get where they was going. They hated the Samaritans so bad that they didn't even want to walk through their territory. So this woman knew that physically speaking, Jesus couldn't have known whether she was telling the truth or not, or what her answer would be, whether it was accurate or deceptive or whatever. But Jesus knew her condition, and God knows our condition. We might sneak things by each other, but we're not going to sneak things past God. And I think that's a really important thing for us to remember, because a lot of times we'll tend to do things. I mean, an example is, you know, we maybe drive too fast sometimes. We get in a hurry going somewhere, so we put the pedal to the metal, and we're breaking the speed limit. The New Testament teaches us to obey the laws of the land. The speed limit's one of those laws. We may not particularly like the speed limit that's posted. We might think we're a high-performance enough driver that it'd be safe for us to drive 20 miles over that, and maybe we are, but it's still the speed limit. If I'm driving down the road going too fast, most likely none of you are going to know it. I mean, I can sneak it by y'all, but God still knows. So just like Jesus knew this woman's marital condition and where she had been in her past that way, God knows ours too. He knows what's going on. Kelly?
Do you think when she said, I have no husband, do you think she was trying to avoid consequences of the law? Because under the old law, wouldn't she have been stoned?
Yeah. For living with this man, she would have been stoned. Possibly, depending on the circumstances of her divorces, she would have been stoned because she would have been an adulteress. And so, you know, and the Samaritans did. They tried to fuse together the law of Moses and their idol worship together. And so they were familiar. According to the text on this book, they typically only followed the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But still, she would have been familiar with that because that's where the law was given. And so maybe that was possibly what the case was. He was talking about living water, even though she didn't really understand it. But she was trying to avoid him looking down on her for her situation that she's in. Tom?
You know, it's hard to say whether or not, you know, stoning for adultery was a common type of situation. You know, we see where Jesus came, you know, was confronted with that from the Jews. You know, they brought a woman that was caught in the very act, and you know, they proposed that to him. Said, you know, the Bible says, you know, or you know, the law says that she should be stoned. Well, they had a few problems with bringing her because if she was caught with, you know, the law said at that time, you know, both were to be stoned, and you know, they only brought half of the party with it. So it's, you know, the evidence is they didn't do it. You know, David wasn't stoned for the adultery with Bathsheba. So, you know, even though it was in the law, a lot of times it's, you know, they didn't always practice what was in the law. So there, and then the Samaritans were, you know, had a lot of other things to it. You know, if you go back, they probably had some of the stuff that was, you know, that Jeroboam introduced into that area as well. And then when the Assyrians came through, they brought back, they just, you know, sent back people that, to be priests that they gave the law to come back and be priests for the people. So there was a number of things that were going on that their whole practice was there, but it was interesting that she still recognized that the Messiah was to come. So she had enough knowledge of some biblical principles to know some things, but she still had this question, you know, which is really right? And that's our world goes through the same thing today. They don't look at authority, and this is basically what Jesus was, you know, the answer that he gave her was an authoritative answer, you know, because he said, you worship the things you don't know. The Jews, you know, worship the things they know. So there's some concepts in there of, you know, doing what God wants you to because God gave the instruction. He didn't give them instructions to worship there in the mountain where they were worshiping. He gave instructions to worship in Jerusalem.
Well, even the Jews that were left in the land after the Assyrian conquest, if they were really following the law, wouldn't have intermarried with these other people that the Assyrians had sent in, because the Jews weren't to intermarry with other nations. They were supposed to have kept their bloodline pure, so they wasn't doing that. But it's interesting when she says, I know that there's a Messiah coming. I mean, from these prophecies of that all the way back to the fall in the Garden of Eden, because God alluded to that when he said, told the serpent, said, there's someone coming and you'll bruise his heel, but he'll bruise your head. And so all the way back to the beginning, there was prophecies of a Christ coming that these people, I don't think, really understood. But nevertheless, she was familiar with them or aware of them. And when she asked about that, told him, so, well, there's a Messiah coming who is called Christ. When he comes, he'll tell us all things. You know, he's been telling her stuff. The hour is coming, and now is, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. And so she said, yeah, I know, there's a Messiah coming, and he's going to tell us everything. And he tells her, that's me. I'm the one. And so it's interesting there. It says at this point his disciples came and they marveled that he was talking with a woman, yet no one said, what do you seek, or why are you talking with her? And the woman left her water pot and went her way into the city and said to the men, come see a man who told me all the things I ever did. Could this be the Christ? And they went out of the city and came to him. In the meantime, his disciples urged him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat of which you do not know. Therefore the disciples said to one another, has anyone brought him anything to eat? And Jesus said to him, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Do you not say there are still 4 months and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest. And he who reaps receives wages and gathers fruit for eternal life. Both he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this saying it is true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored, others have labored, and you have entered into their labors. We'll stop there for a moment. So he tells her he's the Messiah, and then his disciples show up, and they're sort of confused, like we were talking about earlier, that typically a lone man didn't have a conversation with a lone woman that way. And so they're sort of surprised that, you know, what's he doing? He's talking to a woman. And they asked, you know, or why are you talking with her? And it says the woman left, and she left her water pot. And I think at this point, she's starting to understand that Jesus is something special, because he's, like she says, going to tell the people from town, he's told me everything I've ever done, more or less. And she left her water pot. You know, she's initially come out there to bring water back, and all of a sudden that water wasn't so important to her anymore. She wanted to go out there, and she was excited about what she'd heard, and she wanted to share that news. And as we was talking earlier, as James mentioned earlier, we need to be excited about the gospel. It needs to be so excited in our minds, such a big deal in our minds, that we're willing to go, and all our family or all the people we know, we're willing to talk to them about it. You know, another example of that kind of thing happening was when Cornelius was told to send to Joppa to get Peter. When Peter got back, it said Cornelius had gathered all his family and friends there, his whole household, everybody basically, I would say, that was nearby, that was important in his life, he had them gathered there because he was already a religious person. But he's been informed by the Spirit that there was something lacking, and so he knew if he was lacking, then the rest of his household and family and friends was lacking. And there was somebody going to come tell us what they needed to do to be right with God. It was his attitude. There's somebody going to come tell me what I need to do to be right with God, and I want all of y'all to be right with God too. And I'm going to tell you, we're going to find out together. And so that's kind of like what this woman's attitude seems to be. She goes back into town telling everybody, hey, you need to come out to the well and listen to this guy. You know, he's a prophet. He's telling us words of God. I know he's a prophet because there's no way for him to know me, and he's done told me about my past and what I've been doing. And so we need to come listen to him. And it's interesting that, as we'll see in a minute, we'll read a little bit further, that the Samaritans did that. It's interesting when the disciples come back with food, they say to him, Rabbi, eat. And he said to them, I have food to eat which you do not know. And his disciples said to one another, has anyone brought him anything to eat? And Jesus said to him, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. We can see Jesus' priority on doing the Father's will. I don't know how far they'd traveled or how long it had been since he had had anything to eat, but apparently it was obviously time to eat because the disciples had gone in to buy food. And most of us are used to eating it kind of more or less the same times every day. I know at work, when it gets 11:30, I decide to be hungry because that's when our normal lunchtime is. I may not have been hungry till I looked up and seen the clock, seen it was 11:30. It's like, oh, it's 11:30. I hadn't had nothing to eat in an hour or two. I must be starving to death. It's time to eat. Well, these people, the disciples had gone in. It was time to eat. They'd got food, and they come back, and they're telling Jesus, you know, it's time to eat. And he says, I've got food to eat that you don't know of. And he goes on to tell them, my food is to do the will of the Father. Jesus' priority in life was that doing God's will was more important than eating. He'd done fasted for 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, and he knew his time wasn't up. He wasn't about to die. He wasn't going to starve to death. Most of us could miss a meal or two or three or four, and we'll be all right. You know, it's called fasting, and people do it all the time. We'll be all right if we miss a few meals. It ain't going to kill us. And Jesus was saying here, it's more important. Here's people coming from town for me to teach. And teaching them and doing God's will is more important than whether I'm going to miss a meal or not. Tom?
A couple things, too. These Samaritans, they probably had heard of John, preaching in the wilderness, especially down along the Jordan, and baptizing along the coast of Samaria and things. And here Jesus is setting a lot of patterns. And what was the things that he told his disciples prior to being ascended into heaven? He said, remain here in Jerusalem, and the gospel be preached in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. Here he set the groundwork for the gospel to spread. Mm-hmm. And when we see persecution come on the church, where did it go to first? It went to Samaria. Philip went up there. Probably some of these same people that Jesus had spoke to had received the word and became faithful, and Philip was up there preaching to them. This is sort of the groundwork of for the church to spread as God planned.
So as we was talking about a minute ago, asking for a drink of water got that whole city taught. Asking for that drink of water made it easier later on for Jesus' disciples to go there and preach, because they already knew about Jesus. He'd already been there. He'd already done good things for them, and they'd accepted him, and they asked him to stay on for a while. It says he stayed 2 days. And so Jesus, because he prioritized God's word here and doing God's work, was important enough that it helped the spread of the gospel later on. So not just then did he get to teach people, but later on, years later, his disciples will be able to go there and teach again. And then he goes on to talk about it, and he said, who reaps, in verse 36, receives wages and gathers fruit for eternal life. Both he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. And to me, that's a comforting thing, because what that's telling me is we all don't have to do all the work by ourselves. There's somebody that's going to be better teachers than others. There's some of us going to be better at getting people to come to the teacher. The teacher might not be particularly good at getting people to come to listen at all, but somebody else might be good at getting people to come listen. So there's a job for all of us. We don't all have to be teachers. We don't all have to be preachers. We don't all have to be anything in the church, but we all have to do what we can. So that's what Jesus is saying. There's work for everybody, and both the reapers and the sowers, both the teachers and the people that get people to come, are going to share in the reward. So again, it's not that one of us is more important than the rest of us. It's not that one of us is any better than the others. It's not that one of us is any more valuable than the others. We've all got work to do, and there's work that all of us can do. We can't necessarily all do the same things, but we can all do something. And so I think that's what Jesus is telling them here. My job is to come do the will of the Father. My job is to come teach. I can miss a meal or two and teach these people, and I'll be just fine, because doing God's will is more important to me than doing physical things, than eating food. And so we need to have that same attitude. It may be sometime that we get a chance to talk to somebody, and that conversation is carrying on along, and it's going to interfere with us getting home to eat supper. It'll be okay. Let's have that conversation with whoever we might can save their soul. And I don't think there's anybody here that wouldn't say that I'd give up a meal to help save somebody's soul. Tom?
The other thing too is when she left the water pot, she just didn't go back and talk, to her girlfriend. She went right to the leaders of the city and told the men, says, come and see this guy that's out here that can tell me all kinds of things. She wasn't, just back and tell a few girlfriends and things. Oh, well, really? Okay. No, she went through it. Evidently, the indication is she went to them and was very persistent.
Yeah.
Because they came out.
She was enthusiastic enough that they would get from wherever they was to walk this quarter mile out of town to see Jesus too. So, you know, it was a big deal to her, and her enthusiasm was able to be conveyed over to other people. Josh?
One thing about it, kind of what Tom mentioned about her looking for water pot, she meant to come back whether she found anybody to come with her or not. You know, she went to the city to tell people about it, but whether or not she ever was able to bring anybody with her, she was coming back one way or the other to talk to Jesus more.
Yeah, she didn't run home and drop the pot off and then go talk to people.
She didn't say, well, let me go see if I can find a few people to come back with me, we'll be back in just a little bit, but, you know, let me go see if I can find some people. No, she was coming back one way or the other.
That's right. Let's see. Then it talks about in verse 39 that many of the Samaritans of the city believed him, and because of the word the woman testified, he told me all that I ever did. It says they urged him to stay. In verse 40, he stayed 2 days, and many more believed because of his own word, and said to the woman, now we believe, not because of what you said, for we ourselves have heard him, and we know this indeed to be the Christ, the Savior of the world. So we need to have that same attitude. This needs to be important to us. We need to apply ourselves to learning God's word so that we can share it with others.